Okay, so you want to own a TV network, your own channel, your logo in the corner of the screen 24 hours a day, anchors reading the news you decided was news, advertisers lining up to buy 30-second slots during your highest rated hour, millions of people in millions of living rooms tuning in because you built something they can't get anywhere else. Ratings coming in every morning like a scoreboard telling you exactly how well you're winning. And underneath all of it, a business that seems almost embarrassingly simple: make a show, sell the airtime around it, collect the check. That is the dream, and it is not entirely wrong. The problem is that almost nobody who has ever tried to build a television network from scratch has ended up owning the version of it they pictured. Billion-dollar networks have launched with A-list backing and shut down in under 3 years, having burned through nearly $1 billion for an audience smaller than a mid-sized YouTube channel. Meanwhile, a network most people can't even name has quietly become one of the single most valuable pieces of media real estate on the planet, without ever needing to be the most watched channel on the dial. And the part everyone assumes is the business, the advertising, is for the biggest and most profitable networks in the world, often the smaller of their two revenue streams. So let's start with the myth, because you have to kill it before anything else makes sense. Most people think a television network makes its money by selling commercial time. You build an audience. Advertisers pay to reach that audience. Bigger audience means bigger ad checks. That is technically true, and it is also almost irrelevant to whether a modern television network is actually a good business, because the real engine underneath almost every profitable cable network in the world isn't advertising at all. It's a fee that has nothing to do with how many people are watching, charged to a company you've probably never thought about, for a service you didn't even know was being paid for. Here's the honest answer. A television network is not a content business. A television network is a toll booth that happens to have a content business built on top of it. Every time you pay your cable or satellite bill, a portion of that money is being distributed, channel by channel, to every network in your lineup, whether you watch that channel or not. This is called a carriage fee, or retransmission consent, and it is paid by your cable or satellite provider directly to the network on a per subscriber, per month basis as a condition of being allowed to carry that channel at all. This entire system exists because of a piece of federal legislation passed in 1992, which gave broadcast television stations the legal right to demand compensation from cable operators in exchange for permission to retransmit their signal. Before that law, cable companies could carry local broadcast stations for free, and broadcasters had no formal leverage to charge for it at all. That single legal change, decades ago, quietly created one of the most durable revenue streams in modern media, and most of the audience paying into it every month has never heard of the law that made it possible. If your cable package includes 120 channels and you only watch 4 of them regularly, you are still, every single month, sending a small check to all 120. That check doesn't care about your ratings. It cares about one thing only: whether your channel is in the bundle. Understanding that one distinction, advertising versus carriage, is the difference between owning a content company and owning a toll road that happens to broadcast television. Let's start with what it actually costs to get in the door. You have 2 broad paths into network ownership. You can build a broadcast network, which requires a license from the Federal Communications Commission to transmit over public airwaves, or you can build a cable network, which requires no government spectrum license at all, but requires something arguably harder to get: a seat inside the channel lineups of every major cable and satellite provider in the country. Broadcast is the older, more regulated path. The FCC controls a finite amount of usable spectrum, and it doesn't hand out new broadcast licenses casually. Most of the broadcast spectrum capable of reaching a serious national audience was allocated decades ago, which is why virtually nobody launches a brand new, from-scratch broadcast network today. Instead, the practical way in is buying an existing station or a group of them. A single network-affiliated television station in a mid-sized American market can sell for anywhere from $20 million to well over $100 million. And owning a group of stations covering enough of the country to matter, the way the largest station ownership groups do, is a multi-billion-dollar undertaking, assembled market by market over decades. On top of the price tag, federal ownership rules put a hard ceiling on how much of the country you're even allowed to control. FCC regulations historically cap the percentage of American television households a single company's owned and operated broadcast stations can reach, meaning even a buyer with unlimited capital cannot simply purchase every desirable station in every major market and stitch together a true national broadcast footprint the way a cable network can achieve through carriage deals alone. Every acquisition has to be checked against that national reach cap, and companies that get close to the ceiling have had to sell off stations in other markets just to close a new deal, turning station acquisition into a constant balancing act between growth and regulatory compliance. This is why the last 2 decades of local television ownership have looked like a slow, methodical consolidation race rather than a series of splashy new launches. The largest station ownership groups in the country didn't get large by building new channels. They got large by buying up local affiliate stations one market at a time, market by market, for years, precisely because each individual station comes with its own local carriage fee revenue, its own local advertising market, and its own retransmission consent leverage over the local cable operator. A group that owns dozens of stations across dozens of markets can negotiate its retransmission consent fees collectively, city by city, at a scale a single independent station could never match on its own. Which means, in this business, size at the local level compounds into leverage at the national level, even without owning a single national cable channel. Cable is the newer path, and it looks cheaper on paper, right up until you understand what you're actually paying for. You don't need a spectrum license. You need a distribution deal. And getting a brand new channel into the lineups of Comcast, Charter, DirecTV, and every other major distributor in the country is not something you get for free just because you made a good show. In many cases, a brand new network has to pay the cable operator to be carried, not the other way around. A reverse fee, sometimes called a launch incentive, that can run into the tens of millions of dollars just to buy your way onto channel 100 and something in enough households to call yourself a national network. Some new cable networks have spent north of $100 million in cumulative launch incentives and marketing before they ever turned a profit, and some never turn one at all. And then there's programming, which for most networks is the single largest ongoing operating cost, and for a certain category of network, the cost that decides everything. If your network's identity depends on premium content, and for a huge share of profitable cable networks, that premium content is live sports. The price of admission is staggering. Multi-year national sports media rights deals routinely run into the billions of dollars annually across a league's full media portfolio, with a single marquee package sometimes worth more than $1 billion a year to a single network. That's not a cost you pay once. That's a cost you renegotiate and watch climb year after year for as long as you want to keep the games that keep your channel relevant. So before your network has aired a single commercial, you are already three things: extremely well capitalized, deeply embedded in a web of distribution relationships you don't control, and committed to programming costs that only ever go in one direction. Let's say you clear all of that. You have your license or your carriage deals, your programming is on the air, your logo is in the corner of the screen. Now, here is where it gets interesting, because this is where the business starts to look nothing like what you pictured. The first thing you learn is that ratings, the thing everyone assumes is the entire scoreboard of a television network, are really only the scoreboard for half the business. Advertising revenue does track ratings more or less directly: more eyeballs, more valuable eyeballs, higher ad rates. But carriage revenue doesn't move with ratings nearly as much as people assume. A network with mediocre ratings, but a contractual carriage fee locked in across 90 million cable and satellite households, is still collecting a steady, predictable, almost bond-like stream of revenue every single month, regardless of whether anyone is actually watching. This is precisely why some of the most profitable channels in American television history are not the most watched. They're the ones that negotiated the highest per subscriber fee and locked it into a long-term contract before anyone fully understood how valuable that leverage would become. The single best illustration of this in the entire industry is ESPN. ESPN has never been close to the highest rated network on television. Broadcast networks and even some other cable channels regularly outrate it in total viewers. But for decades, ESPN has commanded the single highest carriage fee of any cable network in the country, reportedly north of $9 per subscriber per month, a figure several times higher than most other cable networks combined. Multiply that by tens of millions of subscribers, whether or not those households ever tune in, and you get a channel that can generate billions of dollars in guaranteed revenue before a single advertiser buys a single spot. The mechanism behind that price isn't ratings, it's leverage. ESPN built its carriage fee power on live sports rights that cable operators cannot risk not having, because a cable package without live football, basketball, and baseball is a cable package customers will cancel. That leverage, the threat of losing subscribers if a specific channel goes dark, is the actual product being sold in a carriage negotiation. The games are just what makes the threat real. This is also why, for the last 2 decades, the biggest media companies in the world have spent unimaginable sums fighting over sports rights that, on a pure content cost basis, often look like terrible deals. A league media rights package can cost a network more per year than the entire rest of its programming budget combined, and executives sign those checks anyway, because the alternative, a cable bundle without your channel's marquee content, means a smaller audience, a weaker negotiating position with every distributor, and a lower carriage fee at the next renewal. You're not really buying the games, you're buying the leverage the games give you in a completely different negotiation happening in a boardroom with a cable company that has nothing to do with what's actually airing that Sunday. There's a second mechanism sitting underneath all of this that most people never think about: the bundle itself, and who decides what's inside it. For most of cable television's history, networks were sold to distributors in packages, not individually. A distributor wanting one popular channel from a media conglomerate would often be required to also carry several less popular channels from the same company at a combined price in order to get the one they actually wanted. This practice, sometimes debated under the term bundling, meant that owning one indispensable channel could effectively subsidize a whole portfolio of smaller, less essential ones. because a distributor negotiating with a major media company wasn't negotiating channel by channel. They were negotiating for the whole portfolio at once. If you owned the one channel nobody could cancel, you had enormous leverage to get several other channels you owned carried too, at a fee, even if almost nobody watched them. And then there is the audience measurement layer, the piece of the business that decides how much your advertising inventory is actually worth. Nielsen ratings and the newer measurement systems that have emerged alongside them don't just count how many people watched. They estimate the demographic value of who watched, because advertisers aren't paying for eyeballs in general. They're paying for eyeballs in a specific age and income bracket that's likely to buy their product. A network can have a smaller total audience than a competitor and still charge more per commercial if that smaller audience skews toward the demographic advertisers are chasing hardest. This is why late-night talk shows for years commanded outsized ad rates, despite modest total viewership. The audience skewed young and valuable in exactly the way advertisers wanted, even if the raw numbers looked unimpressive next to a daytime rerun with triple the total viewers. Most of that advertising revenue for the biggest networks isn't even sold the way people imagine, one commercial break at a time, reacting to that week's ratings. It's sold months in advance in a process the industry calls the upfronts, where networks pitch their entire upcoming season to major advertisers and ad agencies in a single concentrated selling season, locking in the bulk of a year's ad revenue before a single episode has aired. This is, in its own way, another form of leverage. A network with a strong upfront season has effectively pre-sold a large percentage of its advertising inventory at a guaranteed rate, insulating it somewhat from a single show underperforming later in the year. A weak upfront season, on the other hand, can force a network to sell the rest of its inventory later in a much less favorable market called scatter, at rates that swing with real-time demand and can be considerably less predictable than the guaranteed upfront commitments locked in months earlier. So, who actually loses money owning a television network, and why? Let's talk about Al Jazeera America. In January of 2013, Al Jazeera, the Qatar-based global news organization, acquired Current TV, a struggling cable network co-founded years earlier by Al Gore for a reported $500 million, primarily to obtain Current TV's existing carriage agreements, the actual channel slots in tens of millions of American homes. That acquisition alone tells you how the industry really values a network. Al Jazeera wasn't buying Current TV's shows, its brand, or its audience. It was buying its seat in the cable bundle. Al Jazeera America launched in August of 2013, staffed with hundreds of journalists, built out expensive new bureaus across the United States, and was backed by the deep pockets of its government-linked parent company, with total investment estimates over the network's life running past $700 million. It shut down in April of 2016, less than 3 years after launch. What went wrong tells you almost everything you need to know about this business. Al Jazeera America built a serious, well-funded news operation, but it never built the two things that actually make a cable network valuable regardless of content quality. It never secured the kind of broad, high-fee carriage position that would generate guaranteed revenue independent of ratings, and it never built an audience large enough to make its advertising inventory valuable either. Reports throughout its run put its average primetime audience in the tens of thousands of viewers nationally, a number so small it would have struggled to fill a mid-sized football stadium, let alone justify the ad rates a network of its size needed to sustain hundreds of millions of dollars in annual operating costs. It had inherited some of Current TV's carriage deals, But many distributors were unwilling to significantly expand a channel with that little viewership pulling that much investment, and several key carriage negotiations reportedly stalled or fell short of what the network needed. A network can survive mediocre ratings if its carriage fees are locked in. It can survive weak carriage fees if its ratings are large enough to make advertising lucrative. Al Jazeera America had neither, at a cost structure built for a network that needed both, and there was no version of that math that was ever going to close. It's worth pausing here to note what the failure was not. It was not a failure of journalism or a failure of financial backing. This was one of the best-funded new network launches in cable history. It was a failure to understand which of the two revenue engines actually keeps a network alive, and a failure to build either one at the scale the business required before the money ran out. When Al Jazeera America announced its shutdown in early 2016, the company cited the challenging economics of the U.S. media marketplace, but the deeper story was simpler and less flattering. A network built for the scale of an eventual global newsroom had been trying to sustain that scale on carriage and advertising revenue sized for a channel a fraction of its ambitions. Hundreds of journalists lost their jobs. The bureaus that had been built out across the country over less than 3 years were closed almost as quickly as they opened. And the carriage agreements the company had spent $500 million to originally acquire simply reverted, in most cases, to other programming entirely. The shelf space Al Jazeera had paid so much to secure turned out to be the one asset that outlived the network itself, immediately relet to someone else. Contrast that with ESPN's decades-long carriage fee dominance, and the difference isn't really about content quality at all. It's about which lever you pulled first. ESPN built irreplaceable live sports leverage before streaming disrupted the bundle and locked long-term carriage contracts in at premium rates while cable was still the only game in town. Al Jazeera America arrived late into a market where distributors already had leverage of their own and little appetite to hand a struggling new channel the kind of guaranteed fee treatment ESPN had spent decades earning. Timing in this business is almost as important as execution. This is the part of network ownership the fantasy never shows you. The revenue model is not forgiving of half measures. A network with weak ratings and weak carriage fees isn't a smaller version of a successful network. It's a completely different, much more fragile business, with almost none of the built-in downside protection that makes the biggest networks so durable. There is also a slower structural risk reshaping the entire industry right now, one that even the most powerful legacy networks have had to contend with: cord cutting. Every year, millions of American households cancel traditional cable or satellite subscriptions in favor of streaming alternatives, and every one of those cancellations is a direct hit to the carriage fee revenue that built the modern television business. Pay TV subscriber counts in the United States have declined for well over a decade straight, meaning even a network with a rock-solid, high per-subscriber carriage rate is collecting that rate against a steadily shrinking base of paying households. A network can negotiate a better fee at every renewal and still see total carriage revenue fall if the subscriber pool it's being paid against keeps getting smaller. This is not a hypothetical risk anymore. It is the single biggest strategic problem facing legacy television companies today, and it has forced even the most dominant sports and entertainment networks to build streaming products of their own, cannibalizing their own historic business model before someone else does it for them. Layered on top of that is a risk unique to the carriage fee system itself, the blackout. Because carriage fees are negotiated in multi-year contracts that eventually expire, every renewal is a moment of genuine leverage-on-leverage brinkmanship between a network and a distributor. And when those negotiations break down, The result is a blackout, a channel simply disappearing from a distributor's lineup until a new deal is signed. High-profile carriage disputes between major media companies and major cable or satellite providers have pulled entire bundles of channels off the air for millions of subscribers at a time, sometimes during marquee live events, as both sides use subscriber anger as a negotiating weapon against each other. For the network, a blackout doesn't just mean lost carriage revenue during the dispute. It means real risk of losing subscribers permanently to a rival service that never went dark in the first place, weakening the network's negotiating position the next time the contract comes up. And there is a risk that goes even deeper than any single business decision: content cost inflation that outpaces revenue growth. Sports rights fees, in particular, have climbed for decades in a way that assumes carriage fees and ad rates will keep rising just as fast to cover them. When that assumption breaks, when subscriber losses or a soft advertising market mean revenue growth slows down, while a 9 or 10-figure sports rights renewal is still due on schedule, a network can find itself paying more for its signature content than that content is generating in return, a gap that has forced painful renegotiations, and in some cases the loss of marquee sports properties entirely, across the industry in recent years. And there is a risk that goes even deeper than any single business decision: content cost inflation that outpaces revenue growth. Sports rights fees, in particular, have climbed for decades in a way that assumes carriage fees and ad rates will keep rising just as fast to cover them. When that assumption breaks, when subscriber losses or a soft advertising market mean revenue growth slows down while a 9 or 10-figure sports rights renewal is still due on schedule, a network can find itself paying more for its signature content than that content is generating in return, a gap that has forced painful renegotiations, and in some cases the loss of marquee sports properties entirely, across the industry in recent years. There's one more layer to the cord-cutting problem that makes it more dangerous than a simple, gradual decline. The alternative isn't nothing. It's a direct competitor with a lower cost structure. Every major legacy network has had to build or invest in its own streaming service over the last several years, both to capture cord cutters before a rival platform does, and to have some presence in a distribution model that increasingly doesn't involve a cable box at all. But a streaming subscription typically generates a fraction of what a traditional per-subscriber carriage fee brought in from a full cable bundle spread across a smaller and more price-sensitive customer base willing to subscribe and unsubscribe on a whim in a way a decades-long cable customer never did. Networks are, in effect, being forced to trade a slow-declining, high-margin business for a faster-growing, low-margin one, years before that trade is fully paid off, purely because standing still and hoping cable subscriptions stabilize has proven to be an even worse bet. Put all of that together, and you start to see why the list of networks that have thrived for decades looks so different from the list of networks launched with the most money and the most confidence. It takes an enormous amount of upfront capital just to get a seat in the bundle, or a license to broadcast at all. It requires building genuine leverage through content nobody wants to lose, an audience large enough to matter, or, ideally, both, before your carriage contracts come up for renewal, because a network with no leverage at the negotiating table gets the fee a distributor feels like offering, not the fee the network needs. It requires surviving a structural, industry-wide decline in the very subscriber base that carriage fees are built on, without letting your own streaming strategy cannibalize the legacy business faster than it can be replaced. And it requires all of that holding up simultaneously, contract cycle after contract cycle, because unlike a single bad quarter of ratings, a bad carriage renewal can define the next 5 to 10 years of a network's entire financial reality. So if you do decide you want to own a television network, understand what you are actually signing up to buy. You are not buying a channel that makes money because people like watching it. You are buying a seat inside a shrinking, heavily contracted distribution system where your actual revenue depends less on your ratings than on how much leverage you can hold at your next carriage renewal, where a single lost sports rights package can gut the leverage that took decades to build, and where a well-funded, well-produced network with real journalists and real content can still shut its doors in under 3 years if it never secures either side of the two revenue stream equation that keeps this entire industry alive. The programming is not really the business. It never really was. The programming is the lure, the recognizable, talked about, unmissable signal that gives a network leverage in a negotiation most viewers will never see happen in a boardroom over a contract months before it ever affects what shows up on the channel guide. Everything that actually keeps a network's lights on happens in that negotiation, the per subscriber fee locked in for the next 5 years, the size of the bundle a distributor is willing to pay for, the threat of a blackout neither side really wants. The anchors, the analysts, the marquee shows, they are almost a cost of doing business, dressed up as the main event. That is the actual bet you would be placing if you ever owned one of these networks. Not a bet on any single season's ratings, but a years-long bet that you can keep building or defending enough leverage to survive the next carriage renewal. In an industry where the underlying subscriber base you're being paid against keeps shrinking a little more every year. Most people who dream about owning a TV network are really dreaming about the microphone, the platform, the audience, the ability to put something on a screen and have the country watch. The people who actually make money owning one are the ones who understood long before they ever bought a single station or signed a single carriage deal that they weren't really in the business of being watched. They were in the business of being impossible to cancel. The real asset was never the ratings. It was the leverage, the contract, and a cable bill quietly renewing itself in tens of millions of households every single month, whether anyone changed the channel to watch or not.